Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Tim Gordon. From streaming your favorite show to saving photos on your phone to asking artificial intelligence a question, our digital lives run on a massive network of computers. And more of those computers are being housed right here in Oregon. Data centers, the facilities that store, process, and move the information we use every day, have made Oregon a major player in the tech industry. They brought billions of dollars in investment, created construction jobs, and turned communities like Prineville, the Dalles, and Hillsborough into key locations for some of the world's biggest companies. But that growth is also raising some big questions. And joining us to help us understand more about data centers' big presence in Oregon, including the controversy, is Mike Rogoway. Rogoway has been closely following the data center debate through his reporting as a senior business reporter for the Oregonian. He's been covering Oregon's economy and its largest businesses, from Intel to Nike, for more than 22 years at the O. Rogoway also holds a Master's of Business Administration degree from the University of Washington's Foster School of Business. And Mike, it's so great to have you and your expertise here on Straight Talk today.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me.
You bet. Well, we're going to start with kind of the big picture globally. Tell us about data centers, what they do, and also kind of how they've evolved over the years.
Yeah, well, a data center can be anything from sort of a bank of computers in an office to a very large installation the size of a large shopping mall, like Washington Square or bigger.
Wow.
And as you said during your introduction, I mean, they started out, doing basic computing for an office or a bank or a hospital. Over time, they expanded. They were having our Facebook and Instagram photos, things like that, doing more and more sophisticated corporate tasks. Now with AI, we've had kind of a jump where they've gone from doing more sophisticated kinds of things that we already do on our desktops and laptops to something that's categorically different. Artificial intelligence, it's a different class of computer chip that's running it. It's very energy intensive, it's very computing intensive, and it requires a very large installation to do efficiently. And so we're starting to see those emerge around the country and in Oregon.
Yeah, and it's grown by degrees, huge degrees, right? With the AI especially coming in.
Yeah, it's a big leap.
So the history of AI and data centers here in Oregon has evolved as well from the start, maybe about 20 years ago, I think, in the Dalles, if I'm not
Yeah,
correct.
you've got it right. Almost exactly 20 years ago, Google built its first large data center anywhere, was in the Dalles. And at the time, it was sort of a curiosity. It's like, well, why is one of the world's biggest tech companies want to build an installation, in a small town on the Columbia River in Oregon? And the reasons were a few. There was good fiber access at the time. BPA had laid fiber access up the gorge alongside its power lines. There was relatively cheap hydropower at the time available to it. And there were good tax incentives. Oregon has a tax structure that's very favorable to industries that spend a lot of money, that are capital intensive. And so, you think, well, you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars in a small town. Who's going to work there? One of the characteristics of data centers is they don't have a lot of employees.
Right.
And so you can put them just about anywhere.
And rural Oregon saw a lot of that early on. I mean, the development over 20 years has been pretty astounding. It's proven to be really good in some ways for some of these places, especially maybe including and maybe especially rural Oregon, but also controversial for several reasons. But first, let's talk about the major center in Prineville 15 years ago and what that was like.
Yeah, so at the time, the company was called Facebook. Now they call themselves Meta.
Right.
And they picked Prineville. They looked at a few locations in the West and another location in Oregon. And if you've been to Prineville, it's really pretty, small town.
Mm-hmm.
All of Crook County, I think, maybe has 15,000 people in it. But there's a bluff up above town. And that's where the airport is. That's where Les Schwab's big tire warehouse is. Other than that, there's not much. It's empty desert, and it was available land. And so Facebook looked at that and said, hey, here's an opportunity for us. They came to town and said, we'll go there. What we want in exchange are very large tax incentives. Oregon has no sales tax. That's a big up for when you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on computers. But we do levy a property tax on most businesses on the equipment that they have to run their business. Well, Prineville and Crook County agreed to excuse Facebook from that. And so that saved Facebook initially like tens of millions of dollars a year. Now it's 60 or 70 million a year, I think,
Wow.
in Prineville. So it's a lot of money. But this was a fading mill town that didn't have much else going for it. Les Schwab had just moved its headquarters from Prineville to Bend.
Right.
So the the town said, let's take a gamble, let's try it. And I think they've been very happy with the results.
Yeah.
That they, it's brought maybe not thousands of jobs, but, a couple hundred there. There's been steady construction at the Facebook site. Apple moved in up the road. They have a similar facility, very close to Facebook's, to Meta's. And so it's been good for them. The question then is the small town getting the best deal? When you're negotiating with a $1 trillion company, can a small community of several thousand people or a county of 12 or 15,000 effectively negotiate?
Right. And especially at this point now where they're probably competing against other communities for the same gig.
Yeah. So, at the time, this was Facebook's first data center
15 years
anywhere
ago, right?
15 years
Yeah.
ago, and they could have put it, so data centers have to be regionally distributed. You can't say, oh, we're going to put them all in China or Indonesia or something like that. They have to be, even electrons take time to move from place to place. So they want them sort of close to their customers, in Facebook's case, close to their users.
Right.
So the West Coast made good sense for that. But there were other places they could have gone in Oregon or elsewhere. They decided that between the taxes, the land, and then there was one other key condition or key consideration there. Facebook in Prineville is the high desert, and so it's fairly cool at night there,
Mhm.
and it can take a lot of energy to cool a data center. Facebook's design, they use evaporative cooling that cools it during the day. At night, even in the summer, they can just essentially open the windows
Wow.
and it cools it off.
Made
So
a
that made
difference.
it an attractive.
Sure. And for the community and the city's coffers, this was a benefit there.
Oh, for sure.
Big time.
They're giving up, as I say, tens of millions of dollars a year in taxes, but Facebook is inside the city limits there, and the city charges a franchise fee on electricity. And so all the electricity that Facebook uses generates money that goes into the city's coffers. So they're able to do things like pay down their pension debt without raising taxes, build parks, other public safety amenities, and without having to raise taxes. So
Yeah.
it's been a great benefit. What's changed now is that I think data centers want to build pretty much anywhere they can, and I think the folks in Prineville are like, I think we could get a better deal now if somebody came.
Interesting.
Steve Forrester, the city manager, says as much.
Yeah.
That if he were to, he wouldn't make the same bet he did the city did 15 years ago. They're in a better position now.
Yeah.
They have better cards.
Yep. And speaking of the current situation here in 2026, based on your reporting, data centers are covering about 2,900 acres of land in Oregon right now, using about 11% of the state's electricity. That's just huge. Some estimates say we're number 3 in the country in terms of data centers. Why has Oregon been such a hotbed for data center development?
Well, we talked earlier about, what they're looking for. They're looking for land, power, fiber optic connectivity, moderate climate is great, and taxes. Oregon sort of starts on third base when it comes to attracting them. We have a lot of these things. We have land, we have a moderate climate. Our tax environment is very favorable because we don't have a sales tax, and because the way we levy corporate income tax, we don't levy it on business that's done out of state. So if the data center's clients are in Silicon Valley or Seattle or Denver, they don't have to pay income tax on the profits they generate from that.
Yeah.
And then we put some frosting on the cake.
Yeah.
As I say, most businesses in Oregon have to pay property taxes on the equipment they have. If you're spending $1 billion on a data center, the taxes on that would be fairly high. But Oregon has readily excused that. It's a program there's 2 different programs. One's called Enterprise Zone and one's called Strategic Investment Program. They date to the 80s and 90s. We've never updated them for the data center era, and the tech companies have cashed in on that.
Yeah. And certainly, there are benefits, but let's talk about the downside, the understandable criticism of water usage, power usage, rates. The tide is turning on some of those things and how many jobs they long term create. I mean, talk about why people are so concerned.
Well, I think, resources, whether they are energy, water, or taxes, I think that's the concern that people are having right now. We'll take them one by one. Start with energy. You mentioned earlier that data centers use about 11% of the state's electricity. For a a long time, starting, maybe around the beginning of the century, Oregon's energy use was about flat. The state's economy was growing, but we were getting more efficient. Things like LED
Sure.
light bulbs made things far more efficient. So even as the economy was growing, we weren't using more power. Over the last 6 or 7 years, that's changed dramatically, and it's all because of data centers.
Yeah.
And so it was a report last fall, that said the Northwest, Washington, Oregon primarily, are facing this sort of 9 gigawatt crunch
Mm.
on electricity availability because data center demand is rising so rapidly. So there's two consequences for that. One is electricity rates could go up, and the other is that there might at times just not be enough power to go around. At times it's very hot, at times it's very cold. When we're using a lot of energy in our homes to keep us cool or warm, depending on the season, the data centers still want to run, and there could be times that we have rolling blackouts like we've
Yeah.
seen in
We have
Texas and other
finite
places.
amount of power.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's energy. Now we'll talk water.
Yeah.
And I think the Dalles is a great example of that. Google uses a great deal of water in the Dalles. It's up to about 40% now of the city's water. And they're getting it from a few sources, but what's concerning to people is that the water coming in from the Dog River has threatened species of fish, and people are concerned that if Google continues to use more and more and more, and they are continuing to expand in the Dalles,
Hmm.
that at some point the amount of water they're drawing from the regional ecosystem will start to affect fish there.
Yeah. And we care about our fish and our environment in Oregon for sure.
For sure. We count every drop. As much as it rains, we seem to need it all.
Yeah. Right. Right.
And the Dalles is on a dry side of the state.
Yeah.
And so they're feeling it especially acutely there. The trick we have there is disclosure. 5 years ago or so, when we tried to find out how much water Google was using in the Dalles, the city sued the Oregonian to try and keep us from getting access to that information. Ultimately, they settled, and Google changed their policy. They now disclose their water use in the Dalles and everywhere else.
Yeah.
But up until then, they didn't. What they still won't disclose is how much water they're going to use in the future. And I think that's what's concerning to people, is that we don't know how much it's going to grow, and it's very difficult to evaluate.
Sure. I'm sure you're looking for those answers in your reporting.
Yep.
Now to the future. Your article late March, I thought was pretty stunning about the amount of land being earmarked for more enormous data centers across the state. Describe that for us in your terms.
Yeah. So if you drive around Oregon, particularly if you drive out 26 through Hillsborough, or you drive out 84 through the Dalles and out to Boardman, the physical landscape of the state is changing. These are enormous facilities. I used the shopping mall comparison earlier. I mean, imagine driving through out in Morrill County where Boardman is. You're driving along, the river's on your left or right, depending on which way you're going. But there's not much along there, and suddenly there are these huge hulking installations, and they really are changing the landscape. This is what we have going all over the country now, but especially in Oregon, because our tax environment is so favorable, is that data centers are looking for any opportunity they have. And as I said earlier, we start on third base. We're very appealing to them because of availability of land, water, energy, and our tax environment. And so, for instance, Amazon has purchased property out there for one 1,300-acre site. It's described in the land use filings there as an exascale site. It would be much larger than what we have now. And it's all designed to accommodate the immense computing needs of AI. And so that's why we're looking to the future, and we're saying, well, what is this going to mean to our power supply? What's it going to mean to water use? Compared to other industries, data centers like in Morrill County, it's heavily agricultural. They
Right.
use a lot of land, a lot of water for farming out there.
Mhm.
Compared to that, data centers don't use a lot, but we said earlier, Oregon counts every drop.
Yeah.
When you add a big new water user, it does have an effect.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you for that. And we're going to take a quick break here on Straight Talk. When we come back, we'll hear from some local leaders in Washington County, Oregon's so-called Silicon Forest, as they try to curb data center development there. Plus, what Mike Rogoway has learned from covering their efforts. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are continuing our conversation on the debates surrounding data center development in Oregon. Now, back in April, we sat down with three individuals representing a coalition of Washington County residents pushing back against new developments in their county. Washington County, more specifically Hillsborough, is home to Intel and other tech companies, and there is a high concentration of data center development there. The group started a petition calling for a temporary moratorium on new data center development in Washington County, which, as of last check, has a little more than 4,500 signatures. Now, we refrained from airing that episode of Straight Talk as all three of our guests were candidates in Oregon's May primary election, and we wanted to avoid elevating any of their platforms over their primary opponents who were not part of our panel. Now that the primary election is in our rearview mirror, we believe the perspectives shared in our April interview are still relevant and worth sharing today. So here's an excerpt from that conversation. We've heard that the massive resources needed to run these. Let's start with electricity. As you were saying, Tualatin Riverkeeper says in 2023, data centers consumed over 11% of electricity in Oregon. And of course, a lot of that in Hillsborough and Washington County. Here we are now in 2025, and presumably more of those data centers have opened up. Myrna, what's the concern? Kind of echo what Tammy was talking about in terms of, especially for individual households and consumers and their electricity bills.
I mean, I just did my taxes and I paid 30% more in electricity this last year than I did the year before. So it was a big concern for me. And when we started getting out in the community and talking to our community, the concern was just rising everywhere. In fact, the three of us met testifying against SB 1586 at the legislature. That was the first moment we met. Now, I had already admired Tammy's fine work at the school board, but Kipperlin was a new face. And what has united us was the want for our community to be heard and listened to as they were raising these important concerns. So behind us is actually a whole community of people that have been fighting for years, working hard to avert this crisis from ending their agricultural jobs, from intruding on their way of living, and from interrupting our Oregon values of prizing the land and the people above all else.
These supporters of the data centers in Washington County point to things like job creation, and property tax revenue, and economic competitiveness in this booming tech AI sector as reasons not to limit development in the county. Respond to concerns that this could stifle what's good about the economy in Washington County.
Can I take that? We do need to be growing jobs. We do need to be growing our economy. And I guess our question is, at what cost? So when we look at data centers in particular, we are not generating good union jobs at the end of this. We are generating a very small handful of long-term jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And to be fair to the workers that are building these right now, and I think that what we see right now is workers that are building these very much want to continue building these. And I deeply respect that. That's kind of the only game in town right now. If you are an electrical worker, you want data centers because that is the only job that's available. And so I look at this as a failure of the legislature to provide alternatives. So what our electrical workers could be doing right now is building out our green infrastructure for transmission. We need that for wind and solar as we transition.
These are big projects, obviously, and to that point, once they're built, the impacts continue beyond electricity use. Water use is also a big issue. And also just the land that these centers take over and pave over in Washington County. Like you said, great soil, great farming going on there. Who wants to talk about that piece?
What this really comes down to, Washington County is our home. We're all a part of this community. And so I saw a quote in the lobby area for Governor Tom McCall, and it conveyed heroes are individuals that speak out in favor of their community and say it's our responsibility to make this a better place. And that's exactly right. These state these state land planning systems have been in place for 53 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really important to understand that right now we're in between economic development and livability in Washington County and throughout the state, I'm sure. We are the economic hub. Hillsborough is the economic hub of the state of the county and the state. And it's important to understand that we basically are down to a monoculture of two pillars of economic opportunity. One being that advanced manufacturing for technology, and the second being public administration. And we need to diversify our opportunities in Washington County since we're such an economic hub. We are not representing our agricultural community. They bring in upwards of $7 billion annually to the state. And Washington County is a huge resource for the entire region. We will disrupt entire ecosystems of that economy if we don't give our farmers a seat at the table.
Now, we did reach out to several local and national organizations asking if they had someone who could represent the perspective of those in favor of data center developments, but none had anybody available in time to join us today. And so we're going to bring back in Mike Rogoway here. And, this has become quite a big issue. The debate is on, but there's also been some real developments. We talked about the Power Act this week, the Public Utility Commission raising rates big time on data centers, giving a break to residential and small business. Talk about where we're at right now.
Yeah, well, people have been concerned for a long time. We discussed earlier
Sure.
the rising power consumption in Oregon because of data centers, and people have been concerned that as we've went to acquire more power, build out the infrastructure, transmission lines to make room to accommodate the growing power consumption, that the costs are being spread among everyone rather than the big new power users, the data centers. So the legislature responded last year, and Oregon is actually kind of out front on this. This was an area where Oregon is a leader and other states are looking to us now, passed what they called the Power Act, and the legislature asked the Public Utility Commission to create a new class of electrical customers, data centers, and assign the cost of serving them to them. And so that resulted with Portland General Electric submitted a rate case to the PUC this spring and proposed a 29% rate hike for data centers and a small, like 1 to 2%
Right.
cut for residential and small business users.
Yep.
Utility consumer advocates say this is evidence that the costs haven't been evenly distributed
Right.
to this point. And so data centers are getting a big bump up, at least the ones in PGE service territory.
Yeah.
Pacific Core is next. I should say that the publicly owned utilities in Eastern Oregon, the electric cooperatives, they already had the authority to assign costs to the users. And so residential rates have been more constant in places like Morrow County than they have been in places like Multnomah County, while data center rates have increased out there.
Right. Well, it's clear that the state is trying to be more involved now in regular, but local jurisdictions want their say, and I just wonder, who's going to win that out? Or there's this last short session there was a moratorium for a year put in place, but we've got corporations trying to work around that in Hillsborough.
Yeah, so what happened is that the legislature said we sort of need some time to think about this. So they put a 1-year moratorium on one class of data center tax incentives, the class
what
that
it
the
was,
data
right.
centers in Hillsborough use. There's quite a few data centers there: LinkedIn, Adobe, TikTok, X.
Wow.
Meta has a facility there that they lease from another company. So there are a lot of data centers out there, about 470 acres or something around in that neighborhood. So they said, okay, no tax incentives for new ones during that time. But the moratorium didn't take effect for 90 days after the session ended. So unsurprisingly, the data centers rushed in with
Yeah.
17 applications for new tax incentives.
Right.
Now, these incentives are nominally limited to 5 years. What happened this time is the data centers tried a new approach that had never been done in Oregon. They said, we want one tax incentive after another in 5-year increments, 5, 10, 15, 20, out into the 2050s. So instead of lasting for just 5 years, they
Right.
last for 25. So when we wrote about this, it created a furor in Hillsborough. People were quite unhappy. They felt that the companies were abusing the process. And that the city hadn't been proactive in addressing this kind of issue. It's been an enormous controversy
And
out
now there's
there.
a lawsuit.
And it triggered a lawsuit
Yep.
by 1,000 Friends of Oregon and Tax Fairness Oregon and others who are saying, we want we want to hold the data centers to account. We want to put some limits on their incentives.
Well, we'll see where it goes. We're out of time, but I'm sure we'll have you back because this is an issue that will continue to be in the mind of people here in Oregon.
Very glad to be here.
Thanks
for having me.
Mike, so much. We'll see you next week.